When World War I ended in 1918, Europe did not celebrate victory. It limped into a fragile peace built on anger, grief, and exhaustion. Empires had fallen, soldiers returned broken, and entire cities lay in ruins. Yet the greatest damage was not physical but psychological. Millions believed the trauma had ended all future wars. But beneath the silence, new tensions were rising. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in 1919, attempted to secure peace by punishing Germany harshly. It stripped the country of territory, abolished its colonies, limited its military, and demanded crushing reparations that its shattered economy could not pay. Instead of rebuilding stability, the treaty ignited resentment. Germans saw it not as justice, but humiliation, a wound that would fester for decades. Across the world, instability spread. The global economy weakened throughout the 1920s before collapsing entirely in 1929 during the Great Depression. Factories closed, banks failed, and millions lost their livelihoods. Democracies struggled to cope, and people began searching for strong leaders who promised simple answers. In Italy, Benito Mussolini rose to power by preaching nationalism and order. His fascist ideology built on violence, expansion, and absolute control inspired similar movements across Europe. In the chaos of Germany, where hyperinflation made money worthless and political violence filled the streets, Adolf Hitler found his opportunity. A former soldier with fierce hatred and ambition, he transformed the small German workers' party into the Nazi Party. Through fiery speeches and propaganda, he promised to restore Germany's pride, destroy its enemies, and undo the humiliation of Versailles. Meanwhile, in Asia, Japan embraced militarism, expanding into Manchuria in 1931 as the League of Nations failed to respond. The world was fractured, frustrated, and desperate, and slowly, the conditions for another global catastrophe were falling into place. By the early 1930s, Germany was a nation on the edge, politically broken, economically crushed, and socially divided. The Weimar Republic struggled to survive wave after wave of crisis. Street battles between communists and nationalists filled the cities. Unemployment soared into the millions, and the German people felt abandoned by their leaders. Into this storm stepped Adolf Hitler, a man whose rise would reshape the world. Exploiting fear and anger, he presented himself as the only figure capable of restoring order. His message was simple but devastating. Germany had been betrayed. Its enemies lived within, and only through absolute unity could the nation rise again. In January 1933, President Paul von Hindenburg appointed Hitler as Chancellor, a decision meant to stabilize Germany, but one that instead opened the door to dictatorship. Within months, Hitler dismantled democracy. The Reichstag fire allowed him to crush opposition, censor the press, and ban political parties. By August 1934, after Hindenburg's death, Hitler combined the offices of President and Chancellor, proclaiming himself Führer. With total control, he launched sweeping changes, rearming the military, creating massive propaganda campaigns, and targeting Jews through discriminatory laws. The Nuremberg laws stripped them of rights, citizenship, and dignity. Germany was being rebuilt, but the cost was human freedom and moral conscience. Hitler's ambitions expanded outward. He defied the Treaty of Versailles by rebuilding the army, reoccupying the Rhineland in 1936, and forming alliances with Italy and Japan. Europe watched uneasily, but most nations, still recovering from World War I, chose appeasement over confrontation. In 1938, the world witnessed a turning point. Austria was annexed in the Anschluss, followed by the dismemberment of Czechoslovakia after the Munich Agreement. Hitler had learned a powerful lesson. Aggression worked, and no one would stop him. As Germany grew stronger, the final step toward war approached. Europe was heading toward another catastrophe, and the world was not ready. By the late 1930s, the world was drifting toward disaster, even if many still refused to see it. Across Europe and Asia, a series of bold, violent moves by aggressive powers revealed a new era of militarism. In Japan, the military had taken control of the government, pushing the nation toward imperial expansion. The invasion of Manchuria in 1931 had been only the beginning. In 1937, Japan launched a full-scale assault on China, resulting in the horrifying Nanjing Massacre, where hundreds of thousands of civilians were killed. The brutality shocked the world, but once again, no nation intervened. The League of Nations created to prevent conflict was proving helpless. Meanwhile, in Europe, Italy, under Benito Mussolini, dreamed of recreating the Roman Empire. In 1935, Italy invaded Ethiopia, using chemical weapons and overwhelming force. Despite international outrage, the global response was weak, encouraging both Mussolini and Hitler to continue their expansionist visions. The Axis powers Germany, Italy, and Japan were slowly aligning, united by military ambition and hatred for the existing world order. Hitler saw opportunity everywhere. In 1938, under the guise of ethnic unity, he annexed Austria in the Anschluss. The move violated international agreements, but European leaders, desperate to avoid another war, did nothing. Encouraged, Hitler turned his attention to Czechoslovakia. The Munich Agreement of 1938 handed him the Sudetenland without a fight. British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain returned home declaring, "Peace for our time," unaware that he had given Hitler the confidence to continue unchecked. By early 1939, Germany seized the rest of Czechoslovakia, breaking every promise made at Munich. The illusion of peace was dead. European nations finally realized that appeasement had failed. When Hitler's eyes shifted toward Poland, a nation guaranteed protection by Britain and France, the stage was set. The world stood at the edge of conflict. The question was no longer if war would come, but when. At dawn, on September 1st, 1939, Europe awoke to the sound of thunder, not from the sky, but from tanks, artillery, and aircraft roaring across the Polish border. Adolf Hitler had unleashed a new kind of warfare the world had never witnessed: Blitzkrieg, or lightning war. German forces struck with overwhelming speed and coordination. Dive bombers screamed through the clouds, smashing communication lines and sowing terror. Armored divisions surged across the countryside, bypassing strongholds and trapping Polish units before they could react. In mere hours, Poland's defensive lines began to crumble. The attack was so sudden that many civilians thought the first explosions were earthquakes. Britain and France, bound by treaty to defend Poland, declared war on Germany on September 3rd. Yet, despite their promises, they could do little to stop the invasion. Their armies were unprepared for the ferocity of Blitzkrieg, and for the moment, the fighting remained concentrated in the east. Poland fought bravely, but its outdated equipment and overwhelmed. Command structure could not withstand the relentless German assault. Then, on September 17th, the situation became hopeless. The Soviet Union secretly aligned with Germany through the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact invaded Poland from the east. Caught between two great powers, the country was divided within weeks. By early October, Poland had fallen. Europe, once hopeful that Hitler could be contained, now understood a terrible truth. Diplomacy had failed, appeasement had failed, and a second global conflict had begun. Across the continent, millions braced for the unknown. Britain prepared for the threat of invasion. France strengthened its defenses along the Maginot Line, and smaller nations watched anxiously, knowing that Hitler's ambitions would not end with Poland. World War II had officially begun, and the world was entering an era of destruction on a scale never imagined. After the rapid conquest of Poland, Germany turned its attention westward. But for several months, Europe entered what newspapers called the Phony War. Despite being officially at war, Britain and France remained behind defensive lines, watching and waiting. The silence ended in April 1940. Germany struck suddenly, launching a coordinated assault on Denmark and Norway. Denmark fell in hours, and Norway soon followed. These victories secured vital ports and allowed German submarines to dominate the North Atlantic. Then, in May 1940, Hitler unleashed Blitzkrieg once more, this time against Western Europe. Instead of attacking France directly through the heavily fortified Maginot Line, German forces stormed through Belgium and the Netherlands. Civilians fled burning cities as tanks and dive bombers devastated defenses. The Dutch surrendered within days, and Belgium soon followed. The speed of the German advance shocked Allied commanders, who realized too late that their strategy belonged to a previous era. As German forces pushed south, a disaster unfolded on the beaches of Dunkirk. Nearly 400,000 British and French soldiers were trapped, surrounded by German armies on all sides. Defeat seemed inevitable, but in one of the war's most dramatic moments, a massive evacuation began. Naval ships, fishing boats, and civilian vessels crossed the English Channel under constant air attack. Against all odds, over 330,000 soldiers were rescued, a miracle of survival that would later inspire Britain to continue fighting. France, however, could not escape its fate. In June 1940, Paris fell, and the French government surrendered soon after. Hitler now controlled most of Western Europe. Only Britain remained defiant, standing alone against the expanding Nazi Empire. As German forces prepared for their next campaign, the planned invasion of the United Kingdom, the war had entered a new phase. The battle for the future of Europe was about to be fought in the skies. By the summer of 1940, Adolf Hitler ruled nearly all of Western Europe. France had fallen, Belgium and the Netherlands were conquered, and Germany now stood face to face with its last remaining enemy, in the West, Great Britain. To force Britain into submission, Hitler planned Operation Sea Lion, an invasion that required one essential condition: complete control of the skies. And so began the world's first major air war, the Battle of Britain. The German Luftwaffe launched its attack in July 1940. Waves of bombers, escorted by deadly fighters, crossed the English Channel daily. Their targets: British ports, airfields, radar stations, and aircraft factories. The goal was simple: destroy the Royal Air Force before it could defend the coastline. But Britain had an advantage the Germans underestimated: a revolutionary radar network that detected incoming aircraft long before they reached their targets. Inside small bunkers across the country, British operators watched blips on screens that revealed the size, direction, and speed of enemy formations. This early warning system allowed RAF fighter squadrons, the famous Spitfires and Hurricanes, to scramble into the air with precision timing. By August, the battle intensified. Dogfights erupted high above English towns and fields. leaving trails of smoke across the sky. Young RAF pilots, many barely 20 years old, fought with unmatched determination. Prime Minister Winston Churchill famously praised them with the words, "Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few." Frustrated by the RAF's resistance, Hitler changed tactics. In September 1940, the Luftwaffe began bombing major British cities, especially London, in a campaign known as the Blitz. Night after night, firestorms consumed entire neighborhoods. Thousands died, yet Britain did not break. By October, failing to destroy the RAF, Germany postponed the invasion. Britain had survived. The Battle of Britain became the first major defeat for Nazi Germany, proving that Hitler's war machine was not unstoppable. On June 22, 1941, as the sun rose over Eastern Europe, more than 3 million German soldiers, along with tanks, artillery, and aircraft, launched the largest invasion in human history, Operation Barbarossa. Hitler believed conquering the Soviet Union would be swift. With its vast lands, resources, and millions of people, the Soviet territory was the ultimate prize in his dream of a greater German empire. The invasion came with shocking speed. German panzers sliced through Soviet lines, encircling entire armies. Luftwaffe bombers destroyed thousands of Soviet aircraft on the ground within hours. Towns, villages, and cities fell one after another. Stalin, stunned by the betrayal despite a non-aggression pact, needed days to respond. Chaos spread across the Soviet ranks. By August, German forces had advanced hundreds of miles, capturing Ukraine, Belarus, and the Baltic states. Millions of Soviet soldiers were taken prisoner, yet the deeper the Nazis pushed, the more resistance they faced. Soviet troops, factory workers, and civilians alike began destroying bridges, burning crops, and sabotaging supply lines. This was scorched earth warfare, denying the Germans anything useful. Hitler then made a crucial mistake. Instead of pushing directly toward Moscow, he redirected his armies south to seize Ukraine's resources. This delay proved fatal. By the time the Germans resumed their approach toward the Soviet capital, winter was coming. As temperatures plunged below freezing, the German blitz slowed. Tanks refused to start. Oil turned to jelly. Soldiers wrapped newspapers around their boots to survive the cold. Meanwhile, fresh, Soviet reinforcements from Siberia, hardened for winter combat, arrived at the front. In December 1941, the Red Army launched a massive counteroffensive. The Germans, exhausted and unprepared, were pushed back from the gates of Moscow. What Hitler thought would be a quick victory had become a brutal, grinding war of survival. Operation Barbarossa marked the beginning of Nazi Germany's downfall, a war against a vast nation that would eventually break the Nazi Empire. On the morning of December 7, 1941, the calm skies above Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, suddenly erupted into terror. Without warning, waves of Japanese aircraft descended upon the American Pacific Fleet. Battleships burned, sailors fought for survival, and explosions shook the harbor. In less than 2 hours, the United States, once determined to stay out of the war, was thrust into the greatest conflict in human history. President Franklin D. Roosevelt called it a date which will live in infamy. Within hours, the United States declared war on Japan. Days later, Germany and Italy. Japan's Axis partners declared war on the United States. What began as a regional conflict had now become a truly global war, stretching across continents and oceans. The American war machine awakened with incredible speed. Factories that once produced cars now rolled out tanks, aircraft, and ammunition. Millions of young men enlisted, while women entered the workforce, in record numbers symbolized by Rosie the Riveter. The U.S. economy transformed almost overnight into an unstoppable engine of industrial power. In the Pacific, American forces fought desperately to slow Japan's advance. The Philippines fell after a brutal siege. Wake Island, Guam, and Hong Kong were lost. But even in defeat, the American spirit hardened. Every setback convinced the nation that the war would be long, costly, and necessary. Meanwhile, in the Atlantic and North Africa, American troops joined British forces to push back German and Italian armies. Convoys braved U-boat attacks to resupply Europe. Bombers launched long-range missions against Axis factories and cities. By late 1942, the United States had fully entered the global struggle not as a supporting player, but as a rising superpower. Its factories, soldiers, and vast resources would soon transform the balance of the war. The world had changed forever, and the United States was now at the heart of the fight to determine the fate of the 20th century. By 1942, the Axis powers still controlled vast territories across Europe, North Africa, and Asia. But the momentum was beginning to shift. The Allies, strengthened by American industry, British resilience, and Soviet manpower, prepared for a series of decisive blows that would change the course of the war. In the Pacific, the turning point came at the Battle of Midway in June 1942. After breaking Japanese naval codes, the United States anticipated the attack and prepared a deadly ambush. In a fierce and chaotic battle, American dive bombers destroyed 4 Japanese aircraft carriers, the heart of Japan's naval strength. What began as a desperate defense transformed into a stunning victory. Japan never regained the strategic initiative. Meanwhile, in North Africa, British forces under General Bernard Montgomery faced the legendary German commander Erwin Rommel the Desert Fox. At the Battle of El Alamein, the British launched a powerful offensive that finally halted Rommel's advance toward Egypt and the Suez Canal. As Allied, reinforcements poured in, including American troops during Operation Torch. The Axis armies were slowly pushed westward toward Tunisia. By May 1943, North Africa was fully in Allied hands. On the Eastern Front, the Soviet Union delivered the most devastating blow yet to Hitler's ambitions. In the frozen ruins of Stalingrad, the Red Army surrounded and trapped an entire German army. Starving, freezing, and running out of ammunition, the Germans finally surrendered in February 1943. This defeat shattered the myth of Nazi invincibility and marked the beginning of a relentless Soviet push westward. Across 3 continents, the Allies had struck back with overwhelming force. The Axis powers were still dangerous, but for the first time since the war began, their advance had been stopped. The tide had turned. Ahead lay the final, brutal phase of the war. By 1944, the Axis powers were trapped on all fronts. The Allies had pushed from North Africa into Italy. The Soviets were storming westward from the ruins of Stalingrad, and the United States was advancing across the Pacific, island by island. The end was approaching, but it would come through some of the bloodiest battles in human history. In June 1944, the Allies launched Operation Overlord, the largest amphibious invasion ever attempted. On D-Day, thousands of ships carried American, British, and Canadian troops across the English Channel and onto the beaches of Normandy. Under crushing machine gun fire and heavy artillery, soldiers fought inch by inch to break through Hitler's Atlantic Wall. By nightfall, the beachhead was secured. and the liberation of Western Europe had begun. Meanwhile, the Soviet Red Army unleashed a massive offensive known as Operation Bagration, destroying entire German armies and pushing deep into Eastern Europe. City after city fell as Soviet forces closed in on Berlin. In the Pacific, the United States fought brutal battles at Saipan, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. Japanese forces refused to surrender, and the cost in lives on both sides was staggering. The closer the Allies came to Japan, the more desperate the fighting became. Yet the war was not over. Japan fought on until August, when the United States dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Faced with unimaginable destruction and Soviet entry into the war, Japan finally surrendered on September 2, 1945. World War II had ended, leaving behind a shattered world, new superpowers, and the beginning of a new era, one defined by reconstruction, hope, and a fragile peace.